It is impossible to overemphasize the importance of the funeral. Hello, this is Steve Googe welcoming you back to another narrated PowerPoint in Church Administration 202. Today we will discuss the importance of the funeral ministry. You cannot overemphasize the importance of the funeral. Because of the associated grief, funerals are usually painful events, but if properly done, they are healing, restorative, victorious, and worshipful. Funeral rituals are universal. According to anthropologists, this means that they all perform in a society some vital function in the social life. We will identify the basic purposes or functions of the funeral in today's narrated PowerPoint. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of conducting a funeral or memorial service for individuals. This is a time that the minister needs to be at his best. It's a time when we love people and give them an excellent context to express their grief. It's a time to encourage the community of faith to come around the survivors to provide comfort. I encourage you to be an advocate who urges every person to be given a funeral or memorial service and a proper burial. I officiated at a funeral service a few years ago that was very sad. The only people attending were the 3 employees of the funeral home and me. There were no survivors, no relatives, no friends, no church affiliation. No one came to say, "This person was special to me." I conducted the service, however, as if 500 people were in attendance. Here's another story told to me by a funeral director that stresses the importance of the funeral, or in this case, a memorial service. A person died, and the family only wanted a cremation without any memorial service. They did not even want the remains, which stayed in the possession of the funeral director. Can you imagine a family not leaving any directions for the disposition of the remains of their loved one? Well, the funeral home director kept the urn that contained the ashes in the corner of the embalming room. Some weeks passed, and the family returned to see the funeral director to express their deep sorrow that they had not provided a proper service for their relative. When the remains were produced, the family expressed a great delight, and they were relieved and asked, "Is it too late to give a dignified burial for our loved one?" They were assured it would be perfectly fine to proceed with a memorial service. The family was expressing private grief when their loss needed to be affirmed in public. I urge you always to encourage families to have some sort of service. Now let's see what you will learn in this presentation. You will learn the importance of a funeral. I've already stated how important the funeral service is, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through the 8 purposes of a funeral. A funeral has at least 8 purposes, and we will identify those. And then we'll talk about terminology that affirms the reality of death. There are some words to avoid, while there are others that we can embrace. And we will conclude the presentation today by talking about some answers to common questions raised at a funeral. For example, should a child attend a funeral service? Or, is it normal and natural for individuals to return to the cemetery after the burial to revisit the loved one? We'll answer those and other questions on the following slides. Welcome to another PowerPoint presentation in Church Administration 202. Hello, this is Steve Googe. I look forward to sharing with you the funeral ministry. It is impossible for me to overemphasize the importance of the funeral. Because of the associated grief, funerals are usually painful events, but if properly done, they are healing, restorative, victorious, and worshipful. Funeral rituals are universal. According to anthropologists, this means that they perform for all societies some vital function in social life. We will identify the basic purposes or functions of the funeral in today's narrated PowerPoint. When you attend a funeral service, a natural question to ask is, why am I here? We certainly could answer it in this way: because someone dies, it's customary to have a funeral service. Of course, that's true enough. But let's go on to ask this question: why is it a customary thing? Why has society developed and maintained over the years this practice? On the slides before you, you will see the purposes of a funeral. On this slide, we will cover 4 of those purposes. Number 1, a funeral makes possible the expression of grief. Grief is a normal, necessary reaction to loss. If it does not find expression in a normal channel, it will affect the behavior of an individual in some other way. In some cases, it will last for a lifetime. The funeral is society's therapeutic mechanism for bereavement. It encourages the expression of grief. The minister can play a valuable role in this process. A second purpose is to honor the deceased. At a funeral service, we pay our last respects. We say by our presence, this person was significant in my life, and his or her death leaves a void. I simply must take note of what has happened. I want and need to commemorate this event, the death of my friend, in this company with these other people. It's a sad time, but I'm truly glad to be here, grateful for this opportunity to honor my friend. The period of lying in state, the funeral, and the burial ritual compose a set of public events that focus upon the deceased, just as they also affect the bereaved. These are events that affirm the significance of the dead person. They also constitute the first step in restructuring the social world from which the deceased is absent. All of this requires that this final chapter be a fitting one for the life of the one who has died. The importance of visitation cannot be overemphasized either. This is a public event during the period of lying in state when the people will assemble and interact with the survivors. 2 points should be remembered. The character of the individual should be reflected in this observance, and there should be many opportunities for people to express themselves about the deceased person. The minister is very important in this process. Whether the funeral effectively fulfills its function as a life-enhancing religious observance depends largely on knowledge, insight, sensitivity, and spiritual depth of the minister. He will minister faithfully and fruitfully if the funeral fulfills its purpose. Now, number 3, comfort the bereaved or provide a framework of supportive relationship for mourners. The family of the deceased urgently needs the assurance that friends care. A funeral service is one way to meet this need. One way for us to say, I want to be with you. I want to share your grief and to help ease the pain. I want to offer my love and to pledge my continuing concern. Death is a time when people circle the wagons in defense against that ancient foe, mortality. The funeral draws together the family and friends in an expression of unity and caring. This supportive network is critically important in dealing with the grief during a funeral and afterward. The minister can make significant contributions to the successful accomplishment of this purpose, that is, comforting the bereaved. The minister needs to know that he is not the entire social support network. Others might be more helpful, at least at certain points. Old, deeply established ties of kinship and friendship may touch the mourner in ways that the minister cannot. And then the 4th purpose of the funeral is to celebrate God's sovereignty. We celebrate His sovereignty over both life and death. At a Christian funeral, we worship God together. We recall with gratitude that although we do not know what the future holds, we do know who holds the future. So, in a profound sense, we rejoice, knowing, as Paul said, that whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Now, on the next slide, we will look at 4 additional purposes for a funeral. From this slide, we will gain information about the next 4 purposes of a funeral. Now, just to review, the purposes of a funeral, number 1, is to make it possible to express our grief. Second, to honor the deceased. Third, to comfort the bereaved. Fourth, to celebrate God's sovereignty. And now we come to the next 4. Number 5 is to open the healing process. Many have called a funeral service a time of closure, but it really is not that at all. Instead of a rite of closure, says Alan Wolfed in the Grief Library, the funeral is a place for a better understanding of the rite of opening, not closing. It marks the formal start of the time of grieving for those who love the person who died. Funerals that are timely and include many people and are highly personalized put grievers on the right path. Such funerals launch healthy mourning. They do not mark the end of it. Yes, it's true that the disposition of the body of a person who died is one aspect of closure during the funeral process, and it's an important one. Caring for, spending time with, and honoring the body helps us embrace the wonder of life and death. When the body is finally laid to rest, we have completed a necessary task that assists with and acknowledges the reality of death. But still, we have not even come close to closure. Equating the completion of burial with closure perpetuates a harmful notion that people should hurry up and get over their grief and return to a normal way of life as quickly as possible. After all, in grief, there is no such thing as closure. Like our love for someone who dies, our grief never really ends. We don't get over it suddenly. Instead, we learn to live with it as we find ways to live forward with meaning and purpose. So the funeral is not about closure at all. It's about a healthy start toward a healing process. Number 6, to give ourselves an opportunity to offer God our honest feelings. Nobody is perfect, and human relationships certainly are not perfect. They all have blemishes. Therefore, at death, there is ordinarily some mixture of emotions. Guilt and regret are often a part of this mix. We say, if only I had not said or done thus and so. Or we say, if I had done this or that. We need to lay the whole burden of our emotions before God, remembering what the Lord says in Psalm 103, verses 11 and 12. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is His loving kindness toward those who fear Him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has He removed our transgressions from us. No, we're not perfect, and we wish we would have said different things, maybe more things, to the deceased person. But God is a forgiving God, forgiving us even of those times we didn't remember to do what was quite right before the person died. Number 7, to remind ourselves of our continuing responsibility. While waiting for the service to begin, we should spend a few minutes pondering such questions as, how can I give practical expression and proof of my love and concern next week, next month, and next year? Regrettably, many will have forgotten the family of the deceased. If the process is to continue, we must go on caring. And then last, number 8, to recognize our own mortality. A funeral service should cause us to reflect on the fragility and on the quality and direction of our own lives. It should stimulate a little soul searching. What would I like for people to say or to think about me when I have finished my journey on this earth? Now, on this slide, I would like to share some things that I trust will be helpful. They come from my observations that I've collected from officiating at many funerals throughout my ministry. I believe these observations will be helpful for you as you will be called on to walk with families through the valley of the shadow of death. Number 1. Do not presume that grieving at a funeral is unchristian. The Apostle Paul instructed the Thessalonians about the resurrection in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. He did this in order that, as he said, and I quote, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. He did not say that they would not grieve at all, but that they should not grieve as those who have no hope. The resurrection certainly assures the bereaved that the loss of their loved one is temporary, not permanent. However, present loss brings present pain, a natural part of the human condition for which Christ was deeply sympathetic. He blessed all of those who mourn, for they shall be comforted, as found in Matthew chapter 5, verse number 4. Number 2, use the name of the deceased person. A depersonalized funeral service suggests that the minister does not know the person who died, or that he relies on canned ceremonies for virtually all of his funerals. If the funeral does not relate specifically to the deceased, it will not speak to the bereaved. Number 3, involve others in the service. The more a funeral service is a worship service with full congregational participation, the more positive will be its impact. Number 4, what about children? Should children attend the funeral? A carefully guided visit for the children to the funeral home in a small group of family or other trusted adults should be considered if the child so desires. Make it a time for honest answers and deeply shared grief. Number 5, avoid euphemisms for the word death. Use the terminology that affirms the reality of death. Do not just simply say, "He passed away," or "He is no longer with us." Simplicity, dignity, and good taste in word choice make for communication that is both accurate and humane. And number 6, what about revisiting the grave? There is something particularly final about the grave. It bears mute witness that physical death is permanent. Many families customarily return with an intimate circle of friends to the gravesite after the grave has been closed and floral arrangements placed around it. This is typically a time of grief reflecting and can be a very healthy way in moving toward acceptance.